floating the 2% level. And for all intents and purposes, this is likely going to be decided by China, Hong Kong, and the EU as the most important players. So we can predict that it's probably not going to be less than 5%. I mean, not greater than 5%, sorry. So we're looking at what this all means in terms of who can trade with who. For the non-USA situation, trade not involving USA, looking at Annex 2, Y48, all that mixed and dirty plastic. If it's going from a Basel party to another Basel party, the trade is allowed, but only with prior informed consent. And if it's going from an EU country, the 27 EU countries, and it's going to a non-OECD Basel party, then the trade is banned. Because the EU, when they implemented the Basel Ban Amendment, they included Annex 2 together with the hazardous waste. In the U.S. situation, it's quite different. The U.S. being a non-party, if they're going to trade from the U.S. to Basel parties, it's not going to be allowed unless a bilateral agreement exists. Currently, the only one that will work was signed a few months ago with Canada. So the party to non-party ban is really relevant. U.S. is a non-party, so that trade will be technically illegal. Now, it's important to note that the legality or illegality takes place in the Basel parties. So nobody's going to be prosecuted in the U.S., I'm afraid, for launching such an export, but it'll be on the receiving country where this will be considered criminal trafficking in waste. So, the U.S. and Canada, you can trade there, and it's going to be a free trade due to the bilateral agreement. They've decided not to have this Annex 2 listing controlled at all. And in the U.S., going to Basel non-parties, remember there's very few of those. There's only East Timor, Grenada, Haiti, San Marino, South Sudan. So those countries, yeah, you can trade with them, but not advisable. So looking at just the list of where a lot of this waste has been going from the U.S., these countries will be off limits, and they're not the full list, but just an example. Now, as I close, I think a lot of people will be wondering, well, what if the U.S. were to ratify the Basel Convention? How would that change things? And it would change things in this way. Exports of Annex 2 waste, such as that we've been talking about, would be allowed to other Basel parties with prior informed consent. So you could export to Malaysia, for example, if they agreed to it. And the Basel Ban Amendment would have to be accepted by the U.S. because it's now part of the convention. So this would prevent e-waste, which is a form of hazardous waste, from going to non-OECD countries, full stop. Making non-exporting companies much more competitive. The e-stewards, for example, our recycling program, our certification is not allowed to do this now, and they're having to compete with people that are allowed to export to developing countries their e-waste. And then interesting for recyclers, the U.S. recyclers could finally import waste from other countries legally, for example, with Caribbean countries into the U.S. So to find out more about the new amendments, you can go to this site, and you will be able to read them in all their full glory and detail. And now I want to shift gears and have the recyclers respond to the situation and discuss their response to these rules. And first off, I have Craig Thompson coming to us from the UK of FPD Recycling. Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, hi there. So, go on to the next slide, Jim. Great, thank you. So yeah, as Jim alluded to, the 1st of January, the new regulations came in. It's fair to say 12 days in, there's a lot of confusion in the market, especially in the European recyclers. So the Malaysian buyers or Chinese buyers are still requesting material from recyclers. So today, as an example, there's still The confusing element is that permits have been issued for 2021 to accept plastic scrap, just as they have been in previous years. So the recyclers, of course, have got permits, they've got some duty of care as they have done in the past. And the e-scrap plastics, of course, in volume are relatively low in percentage terms compared to food packaging, bottles, etc. They're not perceived as being an issue. It's really what the consumer sees on the television with bottles and food packaging which are contaminating oceans, etc. So again, causes confusion. And as we all know that are involved with e-scrap and weed plastics, it's extremely complex. There's lots of different polymer types, and of course, as Jim's just said earlier, there are mixed polymer types which fall in there as well.
Sorry, got a little problem here. There we go.
Okay, yeah, to the next slide then, Jim, thanks.
Okay.
So yeah, as for the last slide, the issue, of course, with weed plastics is the amount of different polymer types. It's 10 or more. A plastic drinking bottle might only be 3 polymer types, which are allowed for export. The problem with the e-scrap weed plastics is the multiple polymer types, which obviously have restrictions, and some countries have already got plastics as hazardous that can't be exported anyway. So with those mixed polymers, it is very difficult to recycle and meet the requirements of new regulations. So next slide, check please. So really the only way, we've talked about prior consent, a lot of that did happen in last year in 2020, where the shipper had to get notification from the consignee, the company that you were sending it to in Malaysia, that you would actually allow the shipment to happen. But now these plastics really are looking at going as TFS, the same as sending CRT glass out. That material now, plastic, is classed as red list. It's very costly, it takes a long time to put in place. If anybody's done it for CRT glass, you'll know how long that takes. It's not really viable for e-scrap, obviously the value's not there in the material. But solutions do exist in the US now. There's 1 or 2 new processes. I think equally there are solutions for non-export for being able to treat e-scrap weed plastics in local markets. Next slide. So solutions do exist in Europe. There are, just last year alone in Poland, Portugal, France, new installations that are able to treat weed plastics, e-scrap plastics in country. In the US and Canada, URT and Recyclable both installed new lines for doing processing of e-scrap weed plastics. And new technologies now exist. Our company in the UK is now installing X-ray separation for e-scrap plastics, so not water or density separation, but using X-ray, which is new technology. So again, solutions are existing. And with this separation, then allows clean polymer types, which then could be exported. But as we said earlier, there are many mixed polymer types. So in real summary, there are lots of confusion in the market, and really there's more to sort of come out, I think, over the next week or two as everybody gets to grips with it. There's a lot of exports in the UK to Malaysia, or in Europe to Malaysia, that are in confusion at the minute as to whether or not they can or can't be exported. Okay, thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Craig. We'll save all the questions till the end. And so next up, I've got Steve Wong of Recyclable.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to share my thoughts with everybody here. The first slide is about machinery we have in Hong Kong. We do have a recycling facility in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. Next. So the second one is shredder. And we do have a washing line in Hong Kong as well to do different kind of plastic. Next, please. On the screen, I showed 4 different types of E-square plastic. These are the most recycled one, and the first one is completely scrap. And the second one is TV casing, and the third one is shredded plastic material. And the last one is refrigerated refined. Next. In our industry, actually it's very, very challenging because plastic, especially in E-square plastic, we have not less than 50 different types of plastic, and the most recycled them are PVB, BS, ABS. And the rest of the residue, normally they are PC, PCA, and also some of the material are combined together with flame retardant or other additives. And these are the ones that at this moment are not being recycled, with normally account for 50-60% of them. And the next one I want to mention is in recycling of E-square plastic, we need very, very effective sorting system to segregate or separate different kind of plastic. Especially we do have pork, persisting organic pollutant. There's the one not allowed to be exported, and also nowadays for importation, it also has a concern with most of the importing countries. And next I go to is, even with this automated sorting line like optical or electrostatic separation equipment, it still is very costly and also very time consuming. That's why a lot of E-square plastic going to the Southeast Asian countries. Next. So the most challenging we have also, from time to time we always see E-square plastics not really commercially viable when it comes to recycling, and especially oil price fluctuate from time to time. When the price of oil and prime material price are low, it makes no sense or not much sense to recycle the E-square plastic, because from time to time the cost of recycling is more than the selling price of the recycled material. So what we are looking for probably an alternative to sell our recycled materials not as a cost benefit to the downstream converter. Instead, the use of recycled content is for environmental reasons. And now we look at, unless there's an effective sorting system, normally the recycle of E-square plastic is very, very challenging, especially when we want to reduce the waste limit below 2% in order for export. And the example I give is for E-square plastic, if we want to recycle to the grind form for export, at this moment we need to control the contamination under 2%. And the next thing I look at is export without treatment is almost impossible nowadays under the requirement of the Basel Convention. Next slide, please. Now we look at trade balance. As we see in Southeast Asian countries, there are lots of recyclers, and I would say plastic recycler would amount to something 20,000. And all these recyclers today, they are dying for plastic waste to fulfill or to satisfy their operations. And especially in E-square recycling, normally they have very big capacity in order to achieve economy of scale. And US is one of the largest plastic generating countries. With the Basel Convention, again, there's not much we can do unless we recycle them locally to satisfy the requirement. Next slide, please. So how the recycler or someone like Bukutoni can meet the challenge? In fact, there's no standard answer. What I can think of is we first of all know, or we first of all get to know or familiar with the Basel Convention requirement as to what we can export or what we can import. And secondly, we also had to reach between fellow recyclers to interchange information. Apart from that, we also it's possible to partner with the local companies and also encourage recyclers in the Far East or Southeast Asian countries to process scrap plastic domestically in exporting countries. This applies not only US but also in Europe. And I think our industry in the end will be very much focused on recycling locally or recycling a source of supply. And the last thing in this is we need to move all this capacity. As I just mentioned, there are more than 20,000 recyclers in the Far East, and they can have capacity of 6-7 million tons per month. That includes all the plastic. And we want to use this capacity from Far East move to developed countries. Next slide, please. So talking about going forward, at this moment we have the Basel Convention amendment, and we also have what we are now facing is the coronavirus and also unstable prices, imbalance, supply and demand. I will call it disconnect of what we have and also what we can recycle in the other part of the world. And one of the solutions is to encourage or to promote sustainability, promoting extended producer responsibility and the use of recycled content. For that, we need to have collaboration of government, lawmaker, brand owner, industry, recycler, and the general public. And this is what I'd like to share with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks very much. And now we'll move to Jeff Lloyd of URT LLC.
Great. Thank you, Jim. So I'd like to start just by one, thanking, that's a good spot there. Thanking Craig. This, what I'm going to talk about, our plastic separation recycling system, really started the conversations about 3.5 years ago. If you look at the National Sword Initiative in China, it coincided with that situation, and Craig's expertise really held our hand to get this process started. So almost full circle with him on the call today. If you've done any work with URT, you hear this from us often that we like to be forward-thinking, controlling our destiny, and what that really means is the more we can control the products that come out of our systems, the more we think we can decrease volatility in the market. And everyone on this call will understand that there's a significant volatility in commodity market, particularly around electronics recycling from a physical processing and all the way to revenue value. One of our latest initiative, as you see in this slide, is to implement technology that it's not new technology. It's been around for quite a while. It's just not technology that e-waste companies in the U.S. have decided to invest capital into on a large scale. I believe there are only 3 units in North America now, with the addition of a couple, including ours, this year. Next slide. Our separation system is something you've probably seen and heard of before. It's a 3-tank system. We obviously have in-feed stock that has to be sized. We use other electronic processing equipment for that, shredders, metal removers, optical sort units. Once the material sized, it goes into one of 3 tanks, and we use density separation, like others in the U.S. and around the world. From there, we do get mixed polymer that is clean of metals. You can see here, point number 2. It's our intent is to sell it domestically. Again, that's just allows us to control our destiny, reduce some costs, and it does not mean that it only can be sold domestically. There are outlets, obviously, for this material exporting as well. We can process about 3 tons an hour. That is essentially what we would generate at our main facility. And you can see that the focus is on the PS, ABS, PE, and PP. Next slide. Here's just some photos of the end product. You can see it does get granulated and is clean of metals. And I will say that this is really just phase 1. We didn't approach this lightly. Our ownership and executive team did not approach this lightly 3 years ago. Adding equipment to do this is a significant capital investment, and a lot of conversations and decisions have been made based on current and existing markets, and then essentially a guess as to what's going to happen in the future. I feel that we guessed right, and timing of installation and operation of the unit that coincides well with the new regulations starting a couple weeks ago. But this isn't the end. Obviously, we want to be able to process material from all of our facilities in the U.S. There's multiple. We want to be able to assist our other partner companies and customers that we work with and their volume. And there's potential of moving forward where there can be additional capitalization of equipment to provide single polymer sort and extrusion, which truly would create an owner and destiny. Next slide. Great. All right. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, that was great. What I want to do next is see if there are any other experiences out there from you all. I imagine there's some recyclers in the audience or others that are involved in responding to these new rules. And the way to take the floor if you are involved is to raise your hand, and then Angelo will try to operate your mic and have you ask or tell your story. This is prior to our questions, so these are just experiences here. Do we have any that people want to share?
Yes, so this is Angelo here. If you have questions or would like to share your experience, please raise your hand and I will unmute you and allow you to speak. Looks like we have somebody here, Mark Newton. I will be unmuting you. And you'll just need to unmute yourself there, Mark. There you go.
All right, great, thanks. Thanks for the great presentation, guys. And Jim, I've got a question for you. When you were reviewing the Basel laws or protocol requirements, you noted that mechanical recycling was really sort of the thing that they were focused on. Are there any other types of recycling, chemical recycling, waste energy, or anything like that that are under consideration?
That's an excellent question, Mark. Mechanical recycling was what was said at COP14, but actually the document, the actual minutes refer to R3, which is recycling that's not incineration or waste to energy. So it's recycling of organic materials, and so it's quiet. It's agnostic about whether it's chemical recycling, which is somewhat of a new thing, or whether it's mechanical. Now, there is a debate as to whether they're going to redefine R3, because there is a process looking at all the annexes right now, to just keep it exclusively mechanical. Because that's what was in most people's minds. But of course, the chemical recycling advocates are wanting to keep R3, including that as well. But what can be said definitively is this is not going to be allowed, these exemptions will not be allowed to go to waste to energy or incineration. Angela, looks like we have Mr. Zhang.
Yeah, let me unmute Mr. Jang here. You have been unmuted, Mr. Jang. You will just have to unmute yourself.
Yes. Hi, everybody. It's really a very good opportunity to participate in this webinar. I just want to quickly introduce myself and my company. We operate a company called Bowman Polymer Solution Inc. in Brantford, Ontario, Canada, which is about 40 minutes drive from the U.S. and Canada border at the Buffalo site. So within this facility, we started this project about 2.5 years ago. We had some challenging time on the production, everything. So we actually started the full production several months back. So we have several parts of the process, which is the first is the floating sink. From our understanding, it will be most likely still unlikely to export materials, even you have a simple floating sink process. So over here in our plants, we have 8 tanks. It's a really comprehensive system. And after that, we have electrostatic line, process single polymer. And then from there, we have actually 2 extruding line, pelletizing line, one focused on PS, and the other one primarily focused on ABS. So this is what we've been doing. And as of now, we are taking majority shredded plastic, which is kind of a headache. I'm sure both Craig and Dr. Wong know this pretty well. And we are watching on the belt CRT plastic. Hopefully we'll get into that very soon when the market is more stabilized. So this is our story. As far as we know, we are probably one of the very few companies focused on the remanufacture using the shredded plastic in Canada and the northeast part of the States. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Zhang, thank you. It's really good to hear that there are North American operators that are getting organized to sort and separate the plastics domestically in North America. So it looks like we have Brian Shook.
Brian Shook, I will be unmuting you. And you are ready to speak.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I was just wondering what the name of that company was in Brantford, Ontario.
Yes, I missed it too. So unmute Mr. Shang again.
Give me one moment here. Mr. Jank, you are unmuted.
Yeah, sure. The company name called Bomet, B-O-M-E-T, is a Bomet Polymer Solutions Inc. So we have a couple other sister companies all in the recycling side, in the other one in Ontario as well, and then we do have another one in Buffalo, New York. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, does anybody else have experience they want to share in this regard? Services that are operational that can help respond to these new rules?
Just raise your hand and I will be able to unmute you afterwards.
If not, we'll go ahead and open it up to all types of questions you may have for any or all of the participants, all of the presenters. Go ahead and raise your hand, or if you'd like, you can ask the question in the chat and we will read it aloud.
So we had a question here from Sarah Murray. It is a few questions. The first being, how is this going to be enforced? How will U.S. state program regulators be able to tell if a recycler is complying? And are you aware of any legitimate recycling markets for e-plastics with BFRs?
Wow. I'll answer the first two, and then we'll see if my other panelists can answer the last one about BFRs. So the way international law is usually enforced is by the countries involved. So the parties are charged with enforcing the rules, and they have them in their own national legislation. But I'm afraid, because of the second part of your question, you're referring to the United States. And the United States, not being a Basel party, doesn't have these rules in their national legislation. And so I'm afraid there will be no enforcement. Of course, we really want to communicate as quickly as possible with the Biden administration to see if we can do something about that. Already we're talking to various states to see what they can do. States are challenged by our own Constitution in the United States of affecting international trade. But they can do certain things like make it very transparent what's going on and not give recycling credits for exports that are violating international law and that sort of thing. So we're in dialogue, for example, in California on how they can find ways to enforce this new international law and not get caught out with criminal trafficking. Because as I mentioned, even though it's considered criminal trafficking, and as soon as these exports from the U.S. are on the high seas, Interpol will be alerted and the importing countries will be alerted. There's nothing in the U.S. law that prevents this from happening. So it is a problem for enforcement in the U.S. So we got another question here, and there's one in the chat from Peter Hungary.
Yep. The question from Peter Hungary is, what is the understanding regarding the WEEE exported as whole with electronics and plastics intact? B1110 lists B, waste contained in the annex will not be waste covered by Article 1, Paragraph 1A of this convention unless they contain Annex 1 material to an extent causing them to exhibit an Annex 3 characteristic. Can the mixed plastic part...
Yeah.
Can the mixed plastic...
Oh, sorry.
Can the mixed plastic part in the WEEE be considered as Annex 1 material?
If I understand the question is about electronic waste. And electronic waste is generally considered to be hazardous waste because almost invariably it has some kind of circuitry in it. And the circuitry usually has enough lead or brominated flame retardants in the circuit board to trigger it being a hazardous waste. So with few exceptions, most electronic waste is considered hazardous waste. So it's on the A list and not the B list. And of course the B list is the exception to that. But if it's whole electronics, and of course there's plastic in there with circuitry, most regulators are going to see that as electronic waste with that listing of A1180, and they're not going to consider it as a plastic waste listing because that would be the more rigorous controls would be for the hazardous waste. I hope that answers your question. If you have more of a nuanced question on that I didn't get the answer to, surely send it my way after the webinar.
We have another question from Thin So. They say Myanmar is not assigned for ban amendment yet. Are OECD countries needed to oblique the ban amendment for their country?
Yeah, if I understand the question, Myanmar has not ratified the Basel Ban Amendment, but they have ratified the Basel Convention. And the Ban Amendment is part of the convention now. So any country that's in the OECD is forbidden to export to Myanmar. So all of the developed countries except for the United States are in the Basel Convention, and they would be forbidden to export hazardous waste. And with respect to these new listings, they would have to use prior informed consent, but if they're in the EU, they would have a full ban. So EU countries would not be able to export to Myanmar under any circumstances these new plastics, but a country like Canada could with the consent of Myanmar.
Great. We have a question here from Thomas Hoig. With separation by water, how is that water treated to prevent plastics from being discharged in the wastewater? Would be prohibitively expensive in the states where this is considered treatment? Question mark.
Yeah, I'm hoping someone in our panel could help answer this, and also answer the question which I forgot, which was about markets for BFR plastic.
This is Jeff with URT. I'll just address if I heard the question, the separation with density. So I won't divulge what proprietary solution we use, but you could probably Google it and find the solution. The different liquids, obviously different densities, and plastics will tend to sink or float depending on what the density is.
And does anybody have an answer to the question of BFR plastic market? Craig?
Yeah, Jim. So, in answer to the question on the BFR, the UK government actually last year put an export ban on all e-scrap plastics containing BFRs or persistent organic pops. So the only way of treating BFRs under the UK regulations is through incineration, it's high temperature incineration, preferably with waste to energy attached. So recovery targets can still be met on the BFR part of the plastics. So in brief, incineration or high temperature incineration is the only way with the BFR.
So no real markets in the UK. Anybody have anything to add to that?
On the UK regs, it has to be destroyed. It has to be
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
Yes, we have a handful of questions still. We have, hold on a second here. We have Tracy Grisman asking, when do you think the U.S. will join the Basel Convention?
Well, I've learned not to hold my breath. I've been through a lot of administrations since 1989, and we all have, and neither Republican or Democrat administrations have ever achieved this. And now it's getting really glaring, and in particular because of plastics becoming a hot issue at Basel and now being controlled by Basel. Maybe there will be a new impetus. I hope so. The reason I hope so is now the ban amendment is part of the treaty. The U.S. will have to accept that and not export hazardous waste to developing countries anymore. And this problem of not having, implementing legislation and enforcement will be solved as well. So it would be very important that the U.S. does that. I'm hoping we can get that done in this next administration. But there are forces that push back against it. A lot of the industry, unfortunately, has been against the Basel Convention since the beginning, and they hold a lot of sway in Capitol Hill. But we shall see. I can't give a prediction, and I, again, won't hold my breath. Any more?
Yeah, we have a few questions here. You have some reminders up there, Jim. You might want to close them down. We have a question here from Colin Staub. Do you have an estimate of how much e-plastic is exported from the U.S.? I'm curious how much material will be potentially be displaced and be looking for domestic outlets?
Yeah, I don't have an estimate, but I know for a fact, and I'm sure Jeff and others in the industry know that it's been very common to export plastics to countries like Malaysia until this year. And indeed, a lot of that was allowed under the E-Steward standard until these new amendments were adopted, and then E-Stewards as a group of recyclers also considered those to be a hazardous waste controlled by a ban to developing countries. So we kind of went ahead of the Basel Convention official date of this year, January 1. But other recyclers have been sending everything to Asia. And I wonder if Jeff would like to comment, or any of the other recyclers, Steve or Craig.
Yeah, I would like to comment on this point. At this moment, I see there are lots of e-scrap waste plastic going to the body. And normally, or in most of the cases, especially going to tire, people don't use the proper HS code. So it's really difficult to have a real number. And as you know, Thailand forbidden importation of plastic scraps. And also in other countries, there's always a saying that whatever you can put in the container, regardless of what you're going to put as the HS code, the other side of the world can always recycle them. So I don't think we really get a number on this. But I know it's a lot. But it's a lot in terms of like probably 40,000 tons or up to million tons a year.
Yeah, it's very difficult to give precise figures, particularly on the e-plastics, electronic waste plastics. The tariff codes don't correspond to that, and there's an incentive for people not to use the proper tariff codes to avoid signaling concerns with customs officials. So the normal ways of getting that data through the tariff code system and the Comtrade compilation of it is not accurate. Any more questions?
Yes. We have a comment here actually from Hannah. They say, hello, I am from the English Environment Agency, and I can say that we are enforcing the Basel Convention in full by stopping containers, and eventually we will prosecute if necessary. So that's more of a comment, but
Excellent.
Thank you, Hannah, and excellent.
In the past, the UK has been one of the top countries in Europe in terms of enforcement of the waste shipment regulation. So I want to congratulate them on that. Today we did put out a press release noting that the UK, unlike the EU, is going to allow the export of this Y48 category with prior informed consent. Again, I said the EU had banned it going to developing countries. The UK is going to allow it. I was not happy with that. Basel Action Network and other environmental groups not happy, but we hope that the UK will join the EU in banning these plastic waste to non-OECD countries, and maybe even go further and ban all plastic waste, as they've indicated in a recent manifesto. So that's just beside about the situation in the UK.
We have a question here from...
Any more?
We have a handful of questions, a little bit more than
We
10.
got Kitan at the top of their hand
Yep.
raised
We
too.
have Kitan here with how will the extended producer responsibility align with the new rules and the plastic waste? And I'm going to unmute you. Oh, looks like they put their hand down, but feel free to answer that.
Yeah, right now, the EPR laws are not in place for most plastics, and they are being proposed in various fora. So we shall see if we get extended producer responsibility on all of these different types of plastics. In Europe, they're doing some of that. Of course, they're ahead of the game, but the plastics waste movement is looking very seriously at imposing very comprehensive extended producer responsibility on plastic packaging, for example. And of course, for electronic waste in some fora, like in the EU, there is extended producer responsibility. In some states in the US, for certain products, there's also producer responsibility, which impacts the plastics which are part of the equipment. But to answer the question in summary, is people are looking at expanding the EPR concept for plastics dramatically. Not there yet.
We have a question here from Angelina. They say, hello, thank you for the excellent webinar. I am wondering if Canada, Turkey, and China, not having signed the plastic amendment yet, are still considered Basel parties. As I understand, this is relevant regarding the export from Basel parties. Thank you.
Wow, very good question. Those three countries, and I don't have the precise answer, but I know that Canada has now signed, and they did it very recently. So in the Basel Convention, an amendment like this doesn't have to be accepted if somebody raises their hand and says, we don't want to implement this yet. If they don't do that, it automatically gets implemented. So those were the three countries that said we're not ready. But China and Turkey have assured me, and Canada, that it's just a matter of timing that they want to do it. So they may have already done it. I know that Canada has. I haven't checked recently with Turkey and China. But to answer your question, they will still be considered Basel parties no matter what. But every country has the right not to accept an amendment if they wish to.
Great. We have a question here from John, and this question is for the panel. How would you handle and pass the audit for plastic verification process?
This question's for who?
The panel.
Oh, okay. What, I'm not sure of the question. Which verification process are we referring to?
Not sure. John has asked, this question is for the panel. How would you handle and pass the audit for plastic verification process? If you could explain that a little more, John, we would be happy to answer that. They do have a question, particularly for URT. Will the separated plastic be 100% recyclable? And if not, what happens to the unrecyclable product?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So we've already discussed, what plastics don't have a recycling market. So obviously, we'll be generating those, polymers as well. So they're not 100% recycled. It's just not possible in the current market. But generally speaking, except for a few exceptions, the answer is yes.
And where do they go then, Jeff?
Incineration. It's the only option, as Craig described.
And we do have a follow-up question in terms of incineration that aligns with this. Someone has asked, what temperature is required for plastic incineration, depending on the plastic type, I guess?
Does anybody have the answer to that one? Because I think it depends on which jurisdiction, but perhaps Craig knows the regulations.
That was that one, and I get it wrong as well, because it's being centigrade rather than Fahrenheit, but it is definitely high temperature incineration, and you need that attached to waste to energy, so that you're actually generating heat or power from it, so you can actually use that as part of your recovery target. So a normal municipal incinerator is no good. Unfortunately, the plastics have got a lot of chlorine and other hazards in, so again, the incinerator needs to be of a particular type that the filters can scrub the chlorine from the plastic when it's incinerated.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. One is by Maria. They ask, since the OECD countries have decided that the US is out of scope despite Article 11 and cannot trade Y48 plastics with us, will this eventually be extended to all materials covered by the Basel Convention, circuit boards going from the US to South Korea? Question mark.
Yeah, so this gets into a very interesting side story, where after these amendments were adopted, the U.S. at the OECD level protested and said, we don't want the OECD to adopt these new controls on Y48, for example. And they said, we object. And so usually the OECD agreement, which is a trade agreement for recyclables within the OECD countries to trade among themselves, usually the default is they automatically accept the Basel definition. The U.S. protested, and as a result of the protest, Y48 is no longer part of the OECD agreement, which means that if anybody in the OECD wants to trade in Y48, they can't use that agreement. So they have to go back and use their Basel agreement. Now, the U.S., by doing that protest, shot themselves in the foot because they lost a lot of trading partners for Y48, which is why they had to rush and sign a bilateral agreement with Canada. But I think the protest by the U.S. really backfired on them. But the question was, is this going to happen with a lot of other waste? I don't think so. Unless the U.S. again objects to a listing in the OECD, and I doubt they'll object to the ones that are already listed. So it was just a strange little nuance that the U.S. is no longer allowed to trade with OECD countries like Turkey, like Europe, in this new mixed and dirty plastic category.
Great. We have a question from Eugene. They ask, can the U.S. ship electronic plastics to Malaysia with Malaysian consent?
Electronic plastic to Malaysia?
Yeah, with
The US
Malaysian
cannot.
consent.
The U.S., that trade between the U.S. and Malaysia will be illegal because the U.S. is a non-party, but the illegality, the prosecution of that criminal trafficking will have to take place in Malaysia, not in the U.S.
Great. We have a few more questions, about 6 more. What role can companies and manufacturers play, particularly on e-waste and the evident program obsolescence of consumer electronic goods, i.e. computers, cell phones, tablets?
What role can manufacturers play? I think we still have a manufacturer on the call. Mark Newton is still here. We obviously want manufacturers to get rid of the toxicity first and foremost, to do everything they can to enhance collection of the non-toxic wastes. That's one of the biggest problems with plastics, is they're inherently not valuable, not very valuable, and so therefore their collection is difficult, and everything they can do to ensure the collection, and of course, as was mentioned by Steve, for those plastics that need to be produced, that are durable, long-lived plastics, we need to have means to ensure that they are recycled by putting post-consumer plastic into products. So unless there's a need for post-consumer recyclable plastics, unless they're used, they're not going to be any reason to recycle them. So we have to make sure that we can compete with the low price of oil, compete compete with virgin plastic. And the other point I would make, when I forgot to mention, is that we as a society are going to have to get out of the business of making so much plastic. And we'll start with the single-use plastic. So anything manufacturers can do to eliminate single-use plastics, including packaging, is extremely important. We should only be creating plastics which are durable, have a long life, and have a good, safe recycling prospect.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it might be sort of adding to that, Jamie. I mean, in answer to the question from a recycler's perspective, I'm sure Jeff could reiterate this as well. The problem that we have as a recycling industry is the OEM, the manufacturers, not using recycled polymer in new products. So, I mean, in Europe alone, we import 1.2 billion euros of virgin polymer annually to manufacture products. And the issue is finding sustainable local markets for using recycled polymer in new products. That would be a huge win.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've gone overtime here, and I'm happy to keep going with the questions. But before we do that, just so that everyone knows that hasn't logged off yet, that we will post this on the BAN website. So you go into the BAN website library, you will see this posted in a few hours after we have the program finished. So feel free to do that, and also anytime send us questions in writing if you wish. But so feel free to log off if you're not interested in any more questions, but we'll stay put here and answer the questions until at least the next 20 minutes or so. I can do that.
Yes, and this webinar will be sent to your emails afterwards. And so this webinar will be sent to your emails afterwards, and you'll be able to access it. We do have a question for Jeff. The question for Jeff is, do you separate polymers? And 2, what is the output of your process? And 3, if you're able to, who is it sold to?
So I'll start with the last one. I'm not at liberty to divulge our downstream partners. We do separate polymers, but they are still mixed. It's not the individual polymers that come out of the system. What was the second part as well?
The second part is, what is the output of your process?
Right. Yeah. So essentially, it's a granulated mixed polymer.
Great. We have a question here from Lisa. Can you explain when to use Basel code B3011 verse A3210 when exporting these plastics?
Okay, there's actually 3 categories. There's the hazardous plastics, and that's the A list. There's the non-hazardous, that's the B list. And then there's everything else. And that is Y48, Annex 2 list. And you would use the A list if there's something in the plastic, like a brominated flame retardant, which qualifies it as a hazardous waste. So you would have to look further into Basel and see if it's got an Annex 1 constituent and an Annex 3 characteristic at the same time, and then it would be a hazardous waste. You would check with your authorities to see if they agreed that that's a hazardous waste, if you had concurrence on that. But that's a rare plastic. Right now, it will become increasingly common, but right now, it's mainly the brominated flame retardant plastics that are being triggered in certain jurisdictions. What's going to be more common is the Y48, and if it's not an exempted, those 4 categories I mentioned that are the exemptions, they have to be clean pretty much and down to a single polymer with one exception of a mixture. But if it is those, if it's clean and single polymer, then it's going to be the B list, so it'll be non-hazardous. On our website, we have a decision tree which might help you answer your question that you can find on the BAN website. This takes you through, is it this or is it that, and you have a decision tree to see which way to go. But just to be clear, most plastics that are recovered today are going to fall in the Y48 category, just because the market has not been geared up to separate and clean to the degree that's going to be required with these new rules. So almost everything which I showed on those two pictures that's being collected by the e-waste recyclers or by municipalities is going to be controlled as Y48 Annex 2.
Great. We have Anthony asking a question here. What would be the impact of all these amendments on African countries?
Wow. Good question. The EU will not be able to export any of these mixed and dirty plastics to African countries because they're all non-OECD. The trade with the U.S. will not be able to take place legally, so you'll have to be vigilant to make sure you're not getting anything from the U.S., but it will be illegal. There's also the Bamako Convention, which is an African treaty, which would, if you read it, it says that all plastics are banned from, all plastic waste, I should say, are banned to import into Bamako parties. And so the countries in Africa that are part of the Bamako Convention, there's some 20 parties that are part of the Bamako Convention already, they would not be able to bring in any plastic waste into Africa. So, any more, Angela?
We just have one question from Katan, and this is the last question I see here. What options are left for plastic recycling?
So let's say it again.
What options are left for plastic recycling?
Well, I would turn it over to my panel. There's still quite a lot of plastics that are being recycled, but obviously the industry is going to have to make serious adjustments to the way it's been doing business. And that goes from the manufacturers all the way down to the recyclers, the waste hauling industry, everyone in the chain of disposition of plastics and their manufacturer is going to have to make some adjustments to maximize appropriate recycling. But I'll let see if any of our panelists also have some answers to that question.
Hi, I'd just like to comment on this point. For me, as a recycler, I've been in this business for more than 27 years. We have been facing lots of regulatory changes for the last, I would say, 10 years, ever since the Green Fence initiative. And on one hand, we know that there are challenges, not only the regulation or regulatory changes, as well as market force. And on the other hand, we know that recycling is the future. As what Jim just said, we have to adjust ourselves to cope with the changes. And I hope traditionally people buy recycled material because of economic reasons, because they can play with other material or because they can make the product cheaper to be more competitive. And from now and what we experience and what we already see and also discuss, recycled content is getting very popular nowadays, and it's a matter of time whether this recycled content from packaging plastic waste, eventually one of these days it will go to different stream of plastic waste like e-scrap or from carpet or from many other plastic industry. So the future is lay on the mandatory use of recycled content, and we hope one day our downstream converter or manufacturer, they buy plastic not only because of the price, even it is getting more and more expensive in terms of like cost of production. So they buy or they use recycled content because of environmental reasons or because of the regulatory requirements. And I still believe recycling is something for the future and also for now with regards to some of the recycled materials. And yeah, that's why I'm still here. Thank you.
Yeah, the recycling is always going to be part of our waste management strategy and a very important part of it. We just have to do it right. We have to do it safely, and we can't make it the only solution. So much more has to go into the front end of designing products, not using single-use plastics that are inherently wasteful and non-circular. But yeah, recycling is going to play an important role for a long time to come. So with that, I think if we didn't get to your question, just send it on, and you can see how to contact us in this slide, and we will be sending you an email, as Angela said, with a link to this presentation. And once again, I want to thank you all for joining us at whatever time zone and whatever part of the world you're coming to us from. We thank you very, very much. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.